In Chapter 5, we're going to explore the skeletal system, and we're going to start out by looking at bones. In this particular segment, you need to be able to describe the subdivisions of the skeleton, axial or appendicular. You need to list the functions of the skeletal system, be able to name and describe the 4 classifications of bones, describe the anatomy of a long bone, describe the microscopic anatomy of compact and spongy bone, describe the function of osteocytes, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts, describe the formation and repair of bones, discuss the factors involved in bone remodeling, compare and contrast the skull of infants to adults, name and describe the various types of fractures, and describe the homeostatic imbalances related to bones. The skeletal system is composed of the bones and the joints. There's associated cartilage and, of course, the ligaments that hold the bones together. We divide the skeleton into 2 major sections. The axial skeleton, which are all the bones of the trunk and the head, basically the axis of the body, and then the appendicular skeleton, which are all the bones of the limbs and the girdles, that is, the bones that attach the arms and the legs to the axial skeleton. Bones are connective tissue, and you'll remember that connective tissue supports, and obviously the skeleton gives us our shape and supports us, and a great many of the bones protect vital organs. Without bones, our muscles would not be able to move us around very well. Muscles are still responsible for movement because they contract and move, but without bones, we would basically be one big blob, and when the muscles contracted, we would inch along more like a worm than move the way we do. So the bones provide levers for the muscles to pull on so that we can move more effectively. Bones also store minerals like calcium and phosphorus and fat. And finally, bones are the location of the cells that produce our blood cells, red cells and white cells. Blood formation has the fancy term hematopoiesis. Bones can be classified a number of ways. One of the ways we can do it is by the structure of the bone. And basically there are 2 types. There's compact bone and there's spongy bone, sometimes called cancellous bone. And in this cross section through a bone, you see the very dense compact bone here on the edges and the open weave spongy bone here in between. Compact bone is very resistant to stresses laterally. Spongy bone is more resistant to stresses that are twisty kind of stretches. Okay. Bones can also be classified based on their shape, and we have 4 classifications here: long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. Long bones, surprise, surprise, are longer than they are wide. They have a shaft that's composed of compact bone, and the ends are spongy bone covered by a thin shell of compact bone. The bones of the arms and the legs, the fingers, and the toes are long bones. Short bones are more cube-shaped. They're about as long as they are wide. They have a spongy bone center and a very thin compact bone shell. The bones of the wrist and the ankle are examples of short bones. Additionally, there is a special kind of short bone called a sesamoid bone. Now, sesamoid bones are embedded in tendons, and they actually develop based on movement, how you use your joints, because sesamoid bones give a little extra protection to certain joints. We all develop patella, and that's the one sesamoid bone that everyone has, is the patella. But depending upon how you use your joints, you may end up with other sesamoid bones in your hands or your feet or other places in your body. Flat bones are flat and thin bones, tend to be slightly curved. They have a spongy bone interior with thin layers of compact bone on either side. The sternum, your breastbone here, is an example of a flat bone, as well as all of the bones of the skull that surround the brain, your cranial bones. And then irregular bones don't fit any other category. They're odd shaped. They're not short or flat or long, but there's some other odd shape. They are spongy bones surrounded by a thin shell of compact bone, and things like your vertebra, your hip bones, are considered irregular bones. Now, long bones have a little more structure to them than the short, flat, or irregular bones, and the bones are the organs of the skeletal system. They are primarily connective tissue. There's several types of connective tissue associated with bones. There's also nervous tissue because certain parts of the bone have to have stimulation from the nerves. And as we look at the long bone, we have the diaphysis, which is the shaft of the bone, and the diaphysis is hollow. It has in it the medullary cavity, which is where some bone marrow is stored. The epiphysis is the end of the long bone. Now, epiphysis is singular. If you change this I to E and make it epiphyses, that's a plural. Now, each epiphysis is covered with some articular cartilage, and this helps cushion the bones as they grind together in the joints and provides for a little smooth area so that the joints work more freely. The epiphysis is separated from the diaphysis by something called the epiphyseal line. And then there are some membranes associated with the bone. The periosteum covers the outside of the bone. The endosteum lines all of the hollow spaces of the bone. So as we look at this epiphyseal plate, the epiphyseal plate is a bit of hyaline cartilage that is seen when bone is growing. The bone itself can't really grow, but the cartilage can. Whenever the cartilage, that epiphyseal plate, when that ossifies completely, that is when the bones stop growing, and that's when you're left with the epiphyseal line. Now, the epiphyseal line is not something you can see on the outside of the bone, but you'll notice it on X-ray because it'll have a little different density on X-ray. The medullary cavity is going to have the bone marrow in it. Red marrow is active marrow. It's capable of making red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets. And in children, almost all of the marrow spaces in the bone have red marrow in them because children are actively growing. They're doing more than just replacing their blood tissue. They're adding to it constantly. When you get to be an adult, most of the medullary cavities and the diaphysis of your long bone becomes yellow marrow. Yellow marrow is fat. It's not active. This is where a lot of fat is stored in your bones. Bones also have various lumps and bumps and grooves and depressions on them, holes in them. These are called bone markings. These are where muscles are attached to bone, or there's special depressions or structures so that two bones fit together to make a joint. They're grooves so that blood vessels or nerves can run across a bone very easily. These develop as you get older. They get more prominent based on how you use your bones. So here, looking at this picture of the long bone, and this happens to be a humerus, your upper arm bone that we're looking at. The diaphysis is the shaft, and it's all this compact bone making up the walls of the diaphysis. It is hollow, and there is your medullary cavity. In adults, most of this is going to be filled with yellow marrow, fat. The epiphysis on each end, and this is where we get to use proximal and distal again. The proximal epiphysis will be on the end of the bone closest to the body. The distal epiphysis will be on the part of the bone furthest from the trunk of the body. Notice how these are spongy bone with a thin shell of compact bone. A little bit of cartilage here on the end. This is the articular cartilage. The periosteum is the membrane that lines covers the entire outside of the bone. And the endosteum lines all of the cavities of the bone, not only this big medullary cavity here, but all of these little spaces in the spongy bone. And this just gives you a little bit of a close-up of this area here of the epiphysis, where you have the articular cartilage, the thin sheet of compact bone, and then all of this spongy bone in here. Now remember, compact bone gives you a lot of strength when you try to break this way. Spongy bone gives you more strength when you try to twist and turn a little bit. So you put more of that twisting kind of stress on the ends of the bone and more of that lateral kind of stress on the shaft of the bone. So once again, we see complementarity. Form and function go hand in hand. Now if we look at the microscopic structure of the compact bone a little bit, you will see that it's got all of these little circular units to it. These are called osteons or Haversian systems. And the osteons have little layers in them. It looks a little bit like you've cut across a tree trunk and there are the rings of the tree. And these layers are called lamella. And if you look closely in here, looking at the lamella, here's that central cavity. And here are the bone cells, the osteocytes, trapped inside this matrix. Remember, bone is connective tissue, and connective tissues have cells separated by matrix, that non-living amorphous substance. Now there are connections between all of the cells, and there's connections from this central canal to each cell. These are called the canaliculi, and this is how stuff from the blood, because there's a blood vessel that comes up that central canal. We have little areas so we can have diffusion tracts to get nutrients to the cells and waste products away from the cells. Now here you see it in an actual microscope picture. There's that central osteonic canal or Haversian canal that has the blood vessel in it. These little things that look like spiders out here are the osteocytes. You can see the little fine canaliculi that allow for material from the blood to diffuse to the cells and material from the cells to diffuse back to the blood. Now this whole structure is called the osteon, and osteons can only have 3 or 4 layers to them because there's only so far we can diffuse material and get it to diffuse back. So these can't be huge in size. They've got to be fairly small. Now this particular structure of the bone is what gives it its lateral strength. If you go home and take a toothpick, it's pretty easy to break one toothpick. But if you put about 10 toothpicks in a bundle and try to break them, it gets much more difficult. So each one of these Haversian systems, each one of these osteons is like a single toothpick. But in all of your compact bone, you've got a whole bunch of these bundled together, and that makes them very, very strong. So even though they're tiny, a whole bunch of them together has a lot of strength. Now spongy bone have these bony shaped wedges that are called trabeculae. And all of the space in between, we have red marrow. While the medullary cavity of the diaphysis of the bone tends to replace with yellow marrow, almost all of the spongy bone spaces, not only in the long bones, but also in the flat bones and the irregular bones and the short bones, retain red marrow. You see how a blood vessel from the Haversian system gets out and weaves in through here, so we have blood going into the bone. We sometimes think of bone as being dead, but it's a living tissue. So it's got to have a blood supply to it. And that's how all of these cells out here get nutrition. Now this is an actual look at a cross-section of bone. And here you see the osteocytes in the matrix. Notice again that none of them are very far from this red bone marrow. And the blood feeds the red bone marrow, and that's how the nutrients get into these cells. Now the cells of the bone there are 3 types, and then we have the matrix because this is a connective tissue. Osteocytes are the cells that are the mature bone cells. they maintain the matrix. Osteoblasts are a group of cells that secrete new matrix, and osteoclasts are a group of cells that will eat away the matrix. The matrix of the bone is hard because calcium salts are deposited in there. But there are still, remember in your matrix of connective tissue, you had a lot of different proteins. You still have these protein fibers. You still have collagen and some other proteins in that matrix that gives the bone strength and flexibility. We sometimes get so carried away with how hard the bones are, we forget that they do have some flexibility. Not a whole lot, but a little bit. If you would like to test out that theory that there's something in bone besides calcium, the next time you have chicken, get the wishbone. Put the wishbone in a jar and cover it with vinegar, preferably white vinegar, and let it sit for about a week. The acid in the vinegar will remove the calcium from the bone. You'll still be left with something that looks like a wishbone, but this will be a wishbone you can tie in a knot. It won't be breakable, because once you get the calcium salts out of there, you're left with just the protein part of the bone, and you can see how flexible that is. All right, let's check and see how you're doing here. The medullary cavity of a long bone is found where? The epiphysis, the diaphysis, the epiphyseal plate, or the trabeculae? It's in the diaphysis. Remember, it's in the shaft of the bone. A bone that is longer than it is wide would be classified as a long bone, short bone, flat bone, irregular bone. This is almost too easy for you. Of course, it's a long bone. Short bones are cube-shaped, flat bones are flat and slightly curved, and irregular bones have sort of an unusual shape to them. Let's talk a little bit about ossification, or the formation of bone. Your long bones are laid down in the fetus as cartilage, and this cartilage then ossifies. What happens is some of the cells become osteoblasts, and osteoblasts, remember, build the bony matrix, so they start laying down a bony collar on the outside of the cartilage precursor. The cartilage inside, those cells sort of die as their blood supply is cut off, and that leaves the hollow space in the shaft where the medullary cavity develops. Then some blood vessels invade. We call this the periosteal bud. Invades the cavity, and it appears that this surge of blood and nutrients into this space is what causes the conversion of the spongy bone that's initially laid down into compact bone. And this happens fairly early in fetal life. Toward the end of fetal life, just before birth, the epiphyses start to ossify. So there's some cartilage on the end of the bone that never ossifies, and that becomes the articular cartilage. And we keep a bar of cartilage between the ossifying epiphysis and diaphysis that is your growth plate, that epiphyseal plate. And it is the only area that the bone can grow and get longer. So this is important that this stay unossified until we're finished with growing everybody. So we start out with our cartilage precursor. We begin to lay down the bony cartilage, or the bony collar here, on the shaft. We sort of kill off some of the cartilage cells in here and get the hollow space, the development of the medullary cavity. This periosteal bud, this blood vessel, invades, and that somehow stimulates the osteoblast to reorganize into compact bone. Now, any place there's cartilage, we can have growth length occur. So this is along about the 8th month. We have blood vessels invade each epiphysis, and we start getting bone laid down here. And that bone's going to be spongy bone. The osteoblasts always start out by laying out spongy bone, but only the outer area of this is organized into compact bone. The interior stays spongy bone. Some of the cartilage does not ossify, and that becomes the articular cartilage. And we have this area here, this bar of cartilage called the epiphyseal plate on both ends that remains cartilage in a child. Now, as we grow in childhood, we have two types of growth. We have the bone get longer. We call this interstitial growth. And this occurs because we have all of this growing here and some growing here and here. In other words, all of these cartilage pushes out, pushes out, pushes out, and that makes the bone get longer. And we start to have the cartilage replaced with bone on each edge, but we keep the cartilage plate. Now, if all we did was get the bone longer, it would stay rather thick and heavy. So we also have some other stuff that has to happen. This is called appositional growth, which deals with the thickness of the bone. And this is where we have osteoclast activity come in. Osteoclasts can dissolve matrix, and so they reshape the bone. So as the bone gets longer this way, we start to narrow it in here so that it stays thick here but gets more narrow here. So we resorb the bone, and we end up adding more bone out here so that we kind of keep everything in proportion. Now, the epiphyseal plate is stimulated by hormones. This is how the bone knows to grow. And there are three groups of hormones. We have the growth hormone, we have the sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, and then we have the thyroid and parathyroid hormones. Growth hormone stimulates the cartilage throughout childhood, and this is kind of a steady growth. It's a constant, stimulates constant cell division, so we've got some steady growth throughout childhood. But at puberty, the estrogen and progesterone are released in the female and testosterone in the male, and suddenly these sex hormones cause all kinds of changes in the body. But one of the things that they do is they stimulate the epiphyseal cartilage to grow very quickly. And this is what gives the growth spurt. And if you think about how kids grow, they grow at a pretty steady rate until right around puberty, and then all of a sudden they may shoot up a couple of inches almost overnight. My brother grew 6 inches in 6 months. It was unreal. But as soon as that initial growth spurt is over, these hormones then increase the rate of ossification. And once that cartilage is fully ossified, growth stops. This is why at the end of puberty, you're usually about as tall as you're going to get. There are some exceptions, but generally that's how it goes. Now, the thyroid and parathyroid hormones influence kind of the shaping of the bone. Osteoclasts break bone. And when they do that, when they break down matrix, they're going to release calcium into the bloodstream. Now, our bones are a reservoir for calcium, and calcium is necessary for muscle activity and for blood clotting and some other things. So it's important that we keep our calcium levels pretty steady in our blood. And parathyroid hormones, secreted by the parathyroid gland, is what stimulates osteoclast activity. Parathyroid hormone is secreted when blood calcium levels are low. Osteoblasts form bone, and they're stimulated by calcitonin, which comes from the thyroid gland. And calcitonin helps pull calcium out of the blood, and the place we're going to put it if we're taking it out of the blood is into the bone. Now, to keep straight who does what, blasts build, clasts crush or destroy. And these two hormones, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, stimulate these cells to help maintain blood calcium levels. Now, bones respond to stress. Wherever muscles are attached to bones, if you use those muscles, they stress the bone at that point, and the bone will tend to get thicker there. So the way you use your bones determines where you're going to increase areas on your bone. But the calcium levels in the blood determine when you're going to do it. You've got to have an adequate supply of calcium to stimulate those osteoblasts so that they can deposit calcium in the bone. Now, the skull, particularly the cranium, is a little different. It's made of flat bones as well as some irregular bones, because in the skull we've got the facial bones that are on the front that give us our facial features, and then the cranial bones which surround the brain. Now, during fetal development, the brain grows faster than any other organ. When you are born, your brain is the closest to adult size of any organ in your body. As a result, the skull of a newborn is proportionally larger than the skull of an adult. In a newborn, the skull makes up for about 1/4 of their height, but in an adult, the skull is only about 1/8 of the height of the adult. So there's considerable differences there. Now, the facial bones can grow pretty steadily, but the cranium has to allow for the brain to grow. And by the time you're 2, your brain has reached pretty much full size. If you think about it, between birth and 2, you learn an awful lot. After that, it's just kind of window dressing. So the cranium has to have some ability for the brain to grow. In order to do this, the bones of the cranium, since they're flat bones, are not laid out as cartilage, but rather as fibrous membranes. And they ossify a little differently in that they have different points that ossify, and they kind of merge together. But on the edges of the bone, there remains some of this fibrous membrane material. These are called the fontanelles, and you've got one here on the top and side and here and here. And these allow for the growth of the skull. Also, it allows for the skull to just compress a little bit at birth to make it a little easier to get through the birth canal. Now, by about the age of 2, the fontanelles are pretty much closed up. They're not palpable. You can't feel them anymore. But we still don't have complete fusion of the bones until young adulthood. If you watch some of the medical detective shows, they'll talk about determining the age of someone by looking at the fusion of the skull bones. The facial bones can grow during the entire childhood, which is why the face changes considerably from the baby to the adult. But the shape of the head doesn't change a whole lot. One of the things that can happen to bones pretty much any time during life are fractures. And we used to classify bones as simple, or fractures as simple and compound. We now call them closed and open. Closed means the bone did not break through the skin. Open means it did. And simple fractures, simply the fact that the bone ends don't protrude through the skin, some of those fractures can be anything other than simple. For example, a comminuted fracture is one where there are many fragments to the bone. Maybe someone got run over by a car and the bone was broken into several fragments. That doesn't necessarily mean that the bone broke through the skin. It's a closed fracture, but it's comminuted. A compression fracture is when the bone is crushed, and this is usually when the weight of the body crushes a bone. For example, the vertebrae tend to experience compression fractures in older people. A depressed fracture is when there was an indentation in the bone. A blow to the head might cause a depression fracture in the skull bones. The wouldn't break all the way through, but the bone would break a little bit and be depressed inward. An impacted fracture occurs when the bones break and then the ends are forced together. They're forced into each other. This might happen in someone who fell from a height and tried to land on their feet, or they fell and put their arms forward and broke a bone, but also then pushed the ends of the bone into each other. A spiral fracture is a twisted fracture. You have ragged breaks. This usually occurs when an arm or a leg is twisted pretty abruptly. Spiral fractures in children are sort of a red flag for child abuse. And a green stick fracture is an incomplete fracture. You see this in children because their bones have more protein and less calcium in them, and when they break a bone, it may break incompletely and then kind of snap back into position. This one can be a tricky one to see on x-ray. If they read the x-ray wet, they may miss it. So if you ever have a child that you think has a broken bone, they x-ray it, say it's fine, but they're still complaining a couple of days later, take them back for another x-ray. To treat fractures, you either do a closed reduction or an open reduction. Reduction means you're going to put everything back into position. If you do a closed reduction, you can manipulate the bones externally and get them back in line and splint them and hold them in place until they heal. If it's an open reduction, you're going to have to surgically get to the bone. And this usually happens when they're going to put pins and rods and things like that in because you've got a more complicated fracture. There are basically 4 steps to bone repair. First, a hematoma forms. Now, hematoma is basically a clot, and when you break a bone, you break all those blood vessels, and so all of the blood in those blood vessels clot and form sort of a temporary structure that will hold the ends of the bone together. But that clot is full of fibrin, and we need to replace that with a more stable fiber, so fibrocartilage forms, and you get what's called a fibrocartilage callus. This is then remodeled into bone, so you get a bony callus, and then further remodeling converts the bone back into spongy bone, compact bone, whatever type of bone is supposed to be there. Connective tissue is one of the tissues that heals by regeneration. So you get bone back and you have a fully functional bone once the break heals. So when we first break a bone and we break all those blood vessels and the blood seeps out, we get our blood clot, our hematoma. Then we begin to replace that with fibers and with cartilage. The cartilage then becomes replaced with bone, and then we remodel that bone back to exactly what it's supposed to be, the same type of bone. Now, on the outside, you probably will not see any difference in the bone, but on x-ray, this area will look a little different than the areas around it. So they can tell about breaks by looking at an x-ray, but not necessarily by looking at the bone. One of the homeostatic imbalances of bone is osteoporosis, which is a loss of bone mass. And this particularly occurs in the spongy bones of the vertebra and the hip. What happens is the bones get thin and become very fragile. This is a disease primarily seen in women as a result of aging, so you see it in older women. Because the bones are thin and fragile, they're subject to what are called pathological fractures. That is, stresses that should not break a bone do break a bone. Simply standing up may cause a hip to break, for example. Several things play a role in the development of osteoporosis. One is hormones. It does seem to be linked to menopause, but a diet low in calcium, smoking, a lack of exercise contribute to the speed with which this develops. Asians and Caucasians are more subject to osteoporosis, and women of small stature are more subject to osteoporosis. Rickets is another homeostatic imbalance. Here the bones fail to calcify. Now, in order for bones to calcify, you need an adequate supply of calcium and you need an adequate supply of vitamin D. And we used to see rickets a lot in children that had dark skin and were growing up in areas where there was less sunshine, like the northern states. You would not get enough vitamin D because you need sunlight to get vitamin D, and the dark skin would prevent some of the vitamin D formation as well as the lack of sunlight. So by supplementing their diet with calcium and vitamin D, it would prevent rickets. If you look on your milk, our source of calcium, you will notice that our milk currently is vitamin D enriched. So we've pretty much developed a system where rickets should not be developed. Now, the problem would be when these children started to walk, the bones would not be stiff enough, and so they would start to bend a little bit. So one of the features of rickets would be bowed legs.